Hey everybody, this is my thoughts on the preview campaign of Maiden. This is a first-person shooter developed by Voidpoint and being published by 3D Realms on the Build engine. Bet you never thought you would see a new game on that engine past the 90s, but turns out here we are with Maiden in 2018, and it's currently in early access. The build that's available on Steam in early access is the preview campaign, which is basically set up to be like an old school shareware episode where you have several levels to play through, and it's a decent amount of content for a preview, but obviously it's supposed to whet your appetite for the full game later on down the line. Now, as it stands, the preview campaign doesn't really have much going on in the way of story or anything of that nature, so I'm not really going to talk about that, but what I am going to talk about is, of course, how it looks, how it sounds, and how it plays. So let's go ahead and hop into the presentation, which generally is quite strong when they're going for this kind of old school shooter aesthetic. It is, of course, 2.5D and it runs on the Build engine, although it's a more modified, enhanced version called DWTerminator, which provides support for modern operating systems, modern resolutions, that sort of thing, as well as some engine enhancements that give it a bit more capabilities than what we would have seen back in the 90s. The game's got a kind of gritty cyberpunk aesthetic going on, although it's certainly not all brown and gray or anything like that. It's actually got quite a bit of color in it and is very appreciated. The sprite work looks like it was ripped straight out of the 90s and looks right at home in the Build engine, and even though a lot of the animations are relatively simplistic, they do fit in very well with the aesthetic they're trying to go for, which is of course that old school Build engine shooter. It definitely fits in with the likes of Shadow Warrior and Duke 3D, of course, and Blood, so they've definitely done a great job with the aesthetics, and the sound design is also pretty solid to boot. As you would expect from a proper Build engine game, the protagonist is voiced and she does constantly make snarky comments about things, so that actually fits in quite well with what they're going for, although the lines do repeat very often and there really aren't all that many of them in the preview build, so hopefully they'll improve that when they get to the full game. But aside from her voice acting, there's also the enemy voice acting, which is rather corny and sounds a lot like what you would hear in Half-Life with the various soldiers. Except the audio quality is considerably better, meaning that the voice clips are much more crisp and clear. But like with the protagonist, there's not really a lot going on there at the moment, so hopefully it's something they can improve when they get to the full game. Then you move over into sound effects and music, and by and large the sound effects in this game are very fitting for a Build engine shooter, including various pickup sounds that sound straight out of the 90s, as well as gun and explosion sounds that certainly do the job pretty well, although they really could use a lot more beef to them. Then you move over into the music and you find that the actual soundtrack is a bunch of electronic stuff that fits the game extremely well and also fits the era extremely well, so they've done a very good job with that. So overall, they did an excellent job with the presentation and making it look and sound like an old school Build engine shooter. But the real question is, how does it play? Because if it doesn't play right, then all of that presentation would be for nothing. Well, what we have available to us right now is the preview campaign, which is a rather short, roughly half-hour episode that basically is just there to give you an idea of how the game is going to play when the full game launches later on this year. As such, it has a very limited selection of weapons available, including the basic pistol called the Lover Boy, as well as a shotgun, the grenade-type item, and even a submachine gun. The revolver, shotgun, and submachine gun all have to be reloaded after a certain number of shots, which isn't necessarily the same way that an old school Build engine shooter would handle it, although it's not unprecedented. I mean, you did have the pistol in Duke 3D, and you did have the Uzis in Shadow Warrior, so it is a thing. It's just that the old games didn't have a reload button for you to be able to reload manually, and it's also kind of weird just having a bunch of different guns having the reload function, rather than just one or two like you would see in those other games. But reloading isn't really all that big of a deal, although I would like it if they had the ammo counter showing not just the overall amount of ammo you have, but also the amount of ammo that you currently have in your magazine. For the revolver and the shotgun, that's really not that hard to keep track of, but the submachine gun is considerably more difficult to keep track of how much ammo you have, so you're probably just going to be spamming the reload button on that one. So it would be nice to have the ammo counter reflecting how much ammo you actually have before you had to reload than simply just whatever the maximum amount of ammo that you currently have is. That said, despite the reloading not necessarily being all that much of an old school feature, they do have some pretty satisfying effect on target, with the shotgun shotgun being pretty devastating to most of the enemies, as well as even the submachine gun and the pistol being useful. They all handle quite well, and from what I'm seeing in the limited amount of testing that I've done with it, it seems like there's actually location-based damage, meaning that if you're shooting the enemy in the head, it actually does more damage. It'd be nice if a developer could confirm that, but I haven't found any information on my end other than just what I've observed while playing that would support that theory. Again, a bit of an odd thing for an old-school shooter considering they didn't have location-based damage until you hit the 3D era, and even then it was fairly limited depending on which game you were playing. Now that said, they have confirmed that they are going for something that, even though it is certainly retro-inspired and is going for the very old-school design philosophy, that they are still putting modern tech in there, so maybe that's what I'm witnessing as far as the location-based damage goes. But again, I can't really confirm or deny that other than just simply what you observe while you're playing it, and you can see that throughout this video, where I've been shooting enemies in the head and they go down quicker. But I'm digressing from my main point here. The main point I have to say about the weapon handling is it's definitely inspired by the old school and feels very fitting for the old school, but it does feel like they've tried to incorporate more modern features with it to make it a bit more of a smooth experience. Now we'll see how they handle that when they get the full weapons list into the game later on when they release the full version of the game, but what we have in the demo, or this preview campaign I should say, is definitely an interesting hybrid of old and new school, and it just ends up working really well for the game in general. But the one thing that definitely marks this as a proper old school experience with modern trappings is the level design. It is coherent, it flows very well, and it is extremely obvious that they were basing the designs on what you would see in the old school build engine games. There's quite a lot of interactivity, and most importantly, there are a ton of secret areas. I mean, in the first areas of the game alone, I missed almost 20 secrets. And when I went back and played through the preview campaign again to get the gameplay footage for this video, I even discovered a couple of secrets that I hadn't noticed before, so there's definitely some replay value there in exploring the full levels. And of course, it wouldn't be proper old school level design without keys and backtracking, and this has both of those, so that's greatly appreciated. And it's even done in a way that makes the backtracking not that much of a chore, unlike what you would see in some of the weaker designs of older games. When you find a keycard, it is obviously just something that you have passed before, and it's pretty easy to navigate back to where it was, so when you actually find a key, you don't feel like you have to go through the entire level again and scour the whole thing to find whatever keycard you happen to miss. Once again, the level design flows very well, and they definitely deserve kudos for that. Now, as I said before, the preview campaign is rather short. It's roughly a 30-minute or so campaign, depending on what difficulty setting you're playing on and how crappy you are at it. But it's definitely enough to give you a good idea of how the game is going to play out when the full version launches later on, and it even includes a boss battle at the end of the preview campaign. It's a fairly basic boss battle, and you don't really have the proper weaponry to deal with it. It really feels like there would be better suited to have a rocket launcher or something along those lines to deal with the mech, but it does give you plenty of ammunition, as well as quite a few of the tracking grenades that you find pretty early on in the level, and which are kind of your bread and butter explosive throughout the whole game. And once you beat the mech, you are actually presented with a screen that looks straight out of a shareware game from the 90s. It gives you a blurb with all the things you can expect from the full release of the game later on, even with some screenshots to go with it. And there's definitely some nostalgia to be had there if you actually were playing a lot of shareware games back in the day. So when you bring the whole campaign together, you find that it's definitely a proper retro revival. It feels like an old school game, but with more modern trappings thrown on there for good measure. It is incredibly obvious that the developers took a lot of design cues from the classic build engine games, and it pays off dividends. But that doesn't mean the game is without its problems. For one, the damage modeling can be a bit inconsistent. That may just be the location-based damage, if that actually is in the game. I'd had to take a developer to confirm that. But you'll notice where you're shooting an enemy and it might take one shot, it might take multiple shots, or it might even take so many shots that you sit there wondering how they even survived. The AI is also very dumb, so they will just kind of wander around aimlessly, or they'll just move directly towards you and get stuck on the environment, or they may even just get stuck on the environment and sit there until eventually you dispatch them. It just is rather unfinished in its current state, that much is obvious. And because the AI is so dumb and it's so difficult for it to actually hit you, it makes the projectile-based weaponry that the enemies have actually a huge detriment to them, because then it makes the game quite a bit less difficult. In terms of difficulty, if you play on the normal setting, the game's pretty much a total pushover because the AI is just that dumb and it's that incapable of hitting you. So hopefully they iron out the AI for the full release and they do actually give it a proper challenge, but as it stands, the preview campaign is very easy, and the only real way you're going to die in it is if you completely screw something up yourself. But there's still time for them to fix that up for the full release, and of course it could just be because I was playing through the preview build on the normal difficulty as opposed to cranking up the difficulty all the way, but that's just because I like to get a baseline for how the general experience of play is going to be when I go into a review or an MTO. And the conclusion I came to there is they definitely need to bump up the difficulty for the full release later on, and hopefully they will. And if they do actually bump up the difficulty, then that will mean that the normal level is a generally challenging experience, and the hard level is for the more old school geezers like myself. So we'll see where the game ends up later on down the line, but as it stands, Ion Maiden is definitely an intriguing game, and it looks like a proper old-school revival, which seems like something we're getting a bit of a renaissance of, with the likes of Dusk and Medieval as well. So I'm definitely looking forward to the full version of this game, although I can see where they might go wrong with it here and there. Hopefully they don't, because they do seem to have some good heads on their shoulders, and they do seem to know what old-school design philosophies they need to follow, but we'll just have to wait and see. And if you want to try out the preview campaign for yourself, I will have a link in the video description box to where you can pick this up on Steam. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you all in later videos.